The fifth turn was the one that told him. Commander Joseph Connolly had already pulled his fighter off its heading 4 separate times that morning. Each time he had swung the nose away from the two contacts climbing out of the African coastline behind him. Each time he had opened the door and invited them to go somewhere else. Each time they had closed it again and come straight back at him. He was flying an F-14 Tomcat off the deck of an American aircraft carrier, and behind him in the second seat sat another commander whose entire job was to look at a radar screen and tell him the truth. Between the two of them, they had a fighter that could see further than almost anything else in the sky, and a set of peacetime rules that said they could not shoot at an aircraft simply for being there. The two contacts were not going anywhere else. They were inside 20 nautical miles and closing at a combined speed of roughly 1,000 knots, which meant that the distance between them was collapsing at about a mile every 3.5 seconds. Below the Tomcat, the Mediterranean ran flat and grey. The fighters had come down to 3,000 feet deliberately, low enough that the sea behind them would clutter and confuse an enemy radar looking down. Connolly had a wingman somewhere off to his right. He had a carrier well over 100 miles to the north with 5,000 people aboard it. He had a rule that said he did not have to wait to be fired upon. And he had, at that closure rate, barely a minute to decide whether the two aircraft in front of him intended to kill him. Nobody had shot at him. That was the problem. Nobody had shot at him at all. It was January 4, 1989. The time was just past noon, local. The aircraft carrier was the United States ship John F. Kennedy, steaming east through the Mediterranean toward a scheduled port call in Israel, roughly 127 miles north of the Libyan coast. The two American fighters belonged to Fighter Squadron 32, the Swordsman, and they were flying combat air patrol about 40 miles north of the port of Tobruk in eastern Libya. Before we go any further, I want to ask you for something small. Cold War Impact is a small channel covering Cold War and military history, and our reach has fallen off badly in recent months. If you find this kind of research worth your time, a subscription, a comment, or a share genuinely moves the needle. Every one of those signals helps the channel reach people who would never otherwise find it, and it is the only reason these deep dives keep getting made. Now, back to the Mediterranean. For 8 years, the United States and Libya had been circling each other in exactly this way. It had started with a line on a map. In 1973, the Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi declared the entire Gulf of Sidra, a vast bite taken out of the Libyan coastline, to be Libyan territorial water. Under international law, the claim did not hold. The Gulf was far too wide across its mouth to be enclosed as an internal bay by any standard the rest of the world recognized. Gaddafi drew his boundary anyway, at roughly 32 degrees and 30 minutes north, and told the world that crossing it meant war. The Libyan press called it the line of death. The United States did not accept the claim, and it did not accept it loudly. American warships and aircraft crossed the line repeatedly through the 1980s in freedom of navigation operations, each one a deliberate legal statement made with weapons aboard. In August of 1981, 2 American Tomcats shot down 2 Libyan fighters over the Gulf. In March of 1986, after Libyan surface-to-air missile batteries fired at American aircraft, the United States sank Libyan patrol boats and struck a missile site. In April of that same year, following the bombing of a discotheque in West Berlin that killed 2 American servicemen and a Turkish woman, American bombers struck targets inside Libya itself. Every one of those confrontations ended the same way. Some American aircrew, alone in a cockpit with an incomplete picture, had to decide whether the thing in front of him was a threat or a nuisance. And by the beginning of 1989, after 8 years of this, the running total was startlingly small. Exactly 4 Libyan aircraft had been shot down by American fighters in the entire confrontation. Not one American aircraft had been lost in air-to-air combat against Libya. 2 engagements, 4 kills, and in both cases, the shooting was finished in little more than a minute. That statistic is the whole story in miniature. The gap between the 2 air forces was not narrow. It was a chasm. And the thing that produced the chasm was not the thing most people assume. It was not the Tomcat speed. It was not the AIM-54 Phoenix, the long-range missile that made the F-14 famous and which was never fired at a Libyan aircraft in either engagement. It was not even, in the end, the radar missiles that the crews actually reached for first. On the morning of January 4, 3 radar-guided missiles were fired at the 2 Libyan fighters, and 2 of them failed to guide at all. What decided the fight was a device that could not hurt anybody. It weighed a fraction of what a missile weighed. It carried no warhead, no motor, and no explosive of any kind. It was a television camera bolted under the nose of the aeroplane, and it existed because of a set of American deaths in a different war 2 decades earlier. Alongside it sat the second thing, which was not a device at all, but a man. And the argument over whether that second man had been needed would go on inside the United States Congress for months afterward. To understand why both of those things mattered so much on that particular morning, you have to go back 6 months to a different sea, a different American warship, and the worst possible answer to exactly the same question. The Strait of Hormuz in the summer of 1988 was one of the most dangerous stretches of water on Earth. The Iran-Iraq war had been running for nearly 8 years and had spilled into the Persian Gulf, where both sides attacked shipping and the United States Navy escorted tankers through a corridor crowded with warships, merchant traffic, and civil airliners flying between countries that were shooting at each other. Into that corridor on July 3, 1988, came the United States ship Vincennes, a guided missile cruiser under the command of Captain Will Rogers III. The Vincennes was not an ordinary warship. She was one of the first vessels built around the Aegis combat system, at that point the most sophisticated air defense system ever put to sea. Aegis was designed to track well over 100 targets at once and to sort them automatically into categories. It represented the absolute leading edge of what money and American engineering could do about the problem of identification. That morning, the Vincennes was engaged in a surface action against Iranian gunboats. Her guns were firing. The ship was maneuvering hard, and at 17 minutes past 10 in the morning, local time, an aircraft lifted off the runway at Bandar Abbas and turned out over the water on a routine commercial route. It was Iran Air Flight 655, an Airbus wide-body airliner carrying 290 people to Dubai. It was flying inside a published civil air corridor. It was climbing steadily on a standard departure. Its transponder was returning a civil identification code. The Combat Information Center aboard the Vincennes did not see an airliner. The crew there identified the contact as an Iranian F-14 Tomcat, one of the American-built fighters Iran had received before the revolution, and they reported that it was descending toward the ship in an attack profile. Warnings were transmitted on military and civil frequencies. The aircraft did not respond to them, which is unsurprising because a civilian airline crew on a scheduled departure had no particular reason to believe that a warning addressed to an unidentified aircraft was addressed to them. At 24 minutes past 10, the Vincennes fired 2 surface-to-air missiles. The aircraft came apart over the water. There were no survivors. 290 people were killed, and 66 of them were children. Then came the part that made the whole event unbearable to the officers who had to review it afterward. When investigators pulled the recorded data from the ship's own combat system, the tapes did not show what the crew had reported. The aircraft had not been descending. It had been climbing away from the ship the entire time, exactly as a civil airliner leaving Bandar Abbas would climb. The most advanced air defense system in the world had recorded the correct information, accurately throughout. Human beings under extreme stress, working from that same information, had read it backwards. Nothing about that failure was simple, and nothing about it was cowardice or malice. The crew genuinely believed they were about to be attacked. They had roughly 7 minutes from first contact to the decision in a ship already in combat, in a strait where an American frigate had been nearly destroyed by an Iraqi missile the previous year, and where an Iranian attack on an American warship was an entirely realistic proposition. They were not fools. They were people who had been handed a machine that could see with extraordinary precision and no ability whatsoever to tell them what a contact intended. The United States never issued a formal apology for the shoot-down. In 1996, as part of a settlement reached at the International Court of Justice, it agreed to pay compensation of $61.8 million to the families of those killed, while continuing to maintain that the ship had acted in self-defense in a combat environment. Captain Rogers received a decoration at the end of his command tour, in line with normal practice, and that decision drew criticism that has never entirely faded. Inside the American military, however, the effect was immediate, and it was not about compensation or apologies at all. It was about a single technical question that had suddenly acquired an enormous amount of political weight. When a contact appears on a screen and it is closing and the rules permit you to shoot before you are shot at, how do you know what it is? 6 months later, 2 American fighter crews would be handed exactly that question, over a different sea, with a clock running considerably faster than 7 minutes. The Air Force that met the Kennedys' fighters that morning was, on paper, one of the largest in Africa, and almost every element of it had been bought rather than built. Muammar Gaddafi had come to power in 1969 at the age of 27, and he spent the following 2 decades converting Libyan oil revenue into military hardware at a rate that had very little to do with the size of Libya's population. Libya had a population of roughly 4 million. It acquired combat aircraft in numbers that would have suited a country 5 times that size. By the mid-1980s, the Libyan Arab Air Force held hundreds of aircraft, and it did not have anything like enough qualified Libyan aircrew to fly them. The backbone of the fighter force was the MiG-23, known in the West by the reporting name Flogger. It was a genuinely interesting machine. Its wings swung, sweeping forward for takeoff and landing and back for high-speed flight, which gave a single airframe a range of behaviors that fixed wing designs could not match. It was fast in a straight line. It was rugged. Across the Soviet bloc and the Arab world, it was produced in enormous numbers, and in the right variant, in the right hands, it was a serious opponent. Libya did not get the right variant, at least not at first. The initial deliveries in the mid-1970s were MiG-23 export models, downgraded specifically for foreign customers, fitted with a simplified radar and restricted to short-range heat-seeking missiles. Later aircraft were substantially better, with an improved radar and the capacity to carry the AA-7 Apex, a radar-guided missile with real reach, alongside the short-range AA-8 Aphid. It is those later interceptors that most accounts place over the water on January 4, and Libya had spent a great deal of money to get them. What Libya could not buy was the thing underneath the hardware. Soviet doctrine, which Libya adopted along with the aeroplanes, did not ask a fighter pilot to hunt. It asked him to be aimed. The system was built around ground-controlled interception, in which a controller at a radar station on the ground held the entire air picture and fed the pilot headings, altitudes and speeds by radio until the target was close enough to see or lock. The pilot was, in a very real sense, the last few miles of a weapon that began on the ground. In a war fought over your own territory with a dense radar network and short distances, this works extremely well. It is efficient, it is centralized, and it does not require you to train large numbers of pilots to think independently, which is expensive and slow. Libya also leaned heavily on outsiders. Foreign instructors and, at various points, foreign pilots from a range of countries flew and maintained Libyan aircraft, and squadrons were staffed in part by aircrew who were not Libyan at all. The result was an air force that could put an impressive number of modern fighters into the sky and could not reliably put an experienced, independently trained crew into any given one of them. Serviceability was poor, flying hours were low. Advanced tactical training against a competent opponent barely existed, for the straightforward reason that there was no competent opponent available to train against. None of this made the Libyan Air Force harmless. It made it brittle. It performed well when the situation matched the doctrine and badly when it did not. The 2 MiG-23s that lifted off that morning came from the airfield at Bomba, near Tobruk on the eastern Libyan coast. More than 2 Libyan aircraft appear to have been scrambled, with the American fighters engaging the leading pair while a second pair of Tomcats from a different squadron stayed with the aircraft they were protecting. From the moment they left the runway, the Libyan pilots were being told where to go by a controller on the ground. That controller was more than 50 miles from where the fight would eventually happen. His search radar at that range could not update quickly or precisely enough to keep 2 pilots informed of what the American fighters were doing from moment to moment. He could see that there were contacts out there. He could pass a heading. He could not narrate a maneuvering engagement in real time, and the 2 men in the Libyan cockpits had been trained inside a system that expected him to. Everything that followed rested on one assumption, and the assumption was structural rather than personal. It was that the man on the ground could see the picture. On the morning of January 4, over the water north of Tobruk, he could not. There was a precedent for all of this, and it is the single most misremembered episode in the entire confrontation. Almost every account of American fighters shooting down Libyan aircraft blurs 2 completely separate events into one. They happened nearly 8 years apart in different places against different aircraft flown by different squadrons from different carriers, and they ended for entirely different legal reasons. Getting them straight is not pedantry. The difference between them is exactly the thing that made January 1989 controversial. The first happened on August 19, 1981. The United States ship Nimitz was conducting a missile exercise inside the Gulf of Sidra, deliberately south of Gaddafi's declared line, in a direct challenge to the territorial claim. Libyan aircraft came out to meet the American aircraft in numbers over 2 days. Most encounters ended with the Libyans being escorted away without incident. On the morning of the 19th, 2 Tomcats of Fighter Squadron 41, the Black Aces, were on patrol. The section lead was Commander Henry Kleeman, with Lieutenant David Venlet in the back seat. His wingman was Lieutenant Lawrence Muczynski, with Lieutenant Junior Grade James Anderson behind him. The aircraft they met were not MiG-23s, they were Sukhoi 22 fitters, a swing-wing ground attack aircraft rather than an interceptor, carrying short-range heat-seeking missiles. The two formations closed head-on. At a range of a few hundred yards, the lead Libyan aircraft fired a missile. It was a poor shot, launched from almost directly in front of the American formation, where an early-generation heat-seeker had essentially no chance of acquiring anything, and it went past without guiding. That single act removed every ambiguity that would haunt the 1989 engagement. The Libyans had fired first in full view at close range. The Americans maneuvered, got behind both aircraft and killed them with heat-seeking missiles. At least one of the Libyan pilots ejected. Accounts of what became of the other differ, and the record is not settled. The whole engagement, from the first Libyan launch to the second kill, took under a minute. Compare that to what happened north of Tobruk. Different carrier, the Kennedy, rather than the Nimitz. Different squadron, the Swordsman, rather than the Black Aces. Different Libyan aircraft, MiG-23 interceptors, rather than Sukhoi ground attack machines. Different location, 40 miles off the eastern Libyan coast, rather than inside the Gulf of Sidra, which lies some 600 miles to the west. Different weapons, with radar-guided missiles doing most of the work rather than heat-seekers alone. And, above all, a different trigger. In 1981, an American pilot was shot at. In 1989, nobody was. That last distinction is the one that carried all the weight afterward. The 1981 engagement required no justification more complicated than a description of what happened. The 1989 engagement required an argument, and arguments can be contested. There is a further layer that most accounts miss. The 1981 confrontation was not the end of the story between the two countries, even in the air. Through 1986, the United States ran a series of operations to assert freedom of navigation across the same disputed water, and in March of that year, Libyan surface-to-air missile batteries fired on American aircraft operating south of the line. The American response destroyed Libyan patrol vessels and struck the missile site at Sirte. A few weeks later, after the West Berlin bombing, American aircraft flying from Britain and from carriers in the Mediterranean struck targets in Tripoli and Benghazi. Libyan air defences fired heavily. Libyan fighters did not come up to contest those raids in any meaningful way. That, in the end, is the point of the precedent. By January 1989, the Libyan Air Force had spent 8 years being repeatedly beaten, avoided, or ignored, and had never once brought down an American aircraft in air-to-air combat. The two MiG pilots heading north out of Bomba were flying into a record that offered them nothing at all to be encouraged by, in aircraft their Air Force had bought and had never learned to use as a system. The camera was not designed to win an argument. It was designed to stop American pilots being killed by their own rules. In the air war over North Vietnam, the United States had gone into combat with the first generation of radar-guided missiles, and a doctrine that assumed the age of the dogfight was finished. Fighters would detect enemy aircraft at long range, launch, and turn away. That was the theory. The reality was that a radar return is not an identification. A blip on a scope in a crowded sky with friendly aircraft, neutral traffic, and enemy fighters all operating in the same airspace tells you that something is there. It does not tell you whose it is. The response, entirely reasonable in isolation, was a rule. Before firing, American aircrew were generally required to identify the target visually. That rule prevented an unknown number of friendly fire incidents, and it also comprehensively destroyed the advantage the missiles had been bought to provide. A fighter designed to kill at 20 miles was forced to close to 2 into the exact envelope where a smaller, lighter, more agile enemy fighter was at its most dangerous. American aircrew died closing that distance. The rule was not wrong. It was simply expensive, and it was paid for in people. The lesson the United States Navy drew from that was unusual, because it was not a lesson about weapons at all. The problem was not that the missiles were too short-ranged. The problem was that the eye could not see as far as the radar. So when the F-14 Tomcat was designed to replace an earlier generation of fleet fighters, the Navy eventually fitted it with an optical answer to an optical problem. The device was built by Northrop and designated the television camera set. Everybody called it the TCS. It was a stabilized, gimbal-mounted telescopic camera fitted in a small pod beneath the fighter's nose, and it could be slaved directly to the radar. The radar found a contact at long range. The camera swung to look at exactly that piece of sky. The picture came up on displays in front of both men. Against a large target in clear air, it could give a usable picture at ranges far beyond what a human being could achieve looking through a canopy, and against a fighter-sized aircraft, it could still deliver an identification well before the two aircraft could see each other by eye. The consequence was quiet and enormous. An F-14 crew could look at an unidentified contact at a distance where the contact could not look back and know what it was. That same design philosophy explains the second seat. The Tomcat carried a crew of 2, and the man in the back was not a spare pilot. He was a radar intercept officer, a specialist whose entire training and career was the operation of the aircraft's radar and weapon system. The AWG-9 radar he ran was a large, powerful, long-range set with a track-while-scan capability, which meant it could hold multiple targets simultaneously while continuing to sweep for new ones. Running it well while a fight developed was a full-time job for a trained professional, and the Navy had decided, at real cost in weight, money, and complexity, that it was worth carrying that professional into combat rather than asking the pilot to fly the aeroplane and interpret the picture at the same time. The bill for that decision was substantial. The Tomcat was heavy, complicated, and expensive to keep flying. Its early engines were a genuine liability, prone to compressor stalls during exactly the hard maneuvering and rapid throttle movements that air combat demands, and capable of putting the aircraft into a spin from which recovery was not guaranteed. In 1984, the Secretary of the Navy told a congressional subcommittee that the engine was probably the worst engine and airframe mismatch the service had seen in many years, and that it had accounted for more than a quarter of all Tomcat crashes. Over the aircraft's career, engine-related causes destroyed dozens of them. So the machine that would go up against the Libyan MiGs was not a flawless superfighter. It was a compromise with a dangerous engine that had spent a very large amount of money on 2 specific capabilities. It could see a long way, and it carried a second human being whose job was to understand what it was seeing. The weapons, by contrast, had a much less encouraging history. The missile the crews would reach for first was the AM-7 Sparrow, a medium-range weapon guided by radar. The principle behind it is called semi-active homing, and it has one significant catch built into it. The missile does not carry a radar transmitter of its own. It carries a receiver. The launching fighter must keep its own radar locked onto the target, continuously illuminating it for the entire flight of the missile. If the lock breaks, if the launching aircraft turns away, if the geometry goes wrong, the missile has nothing to home on and simply flies into the sea. In Vietnam, the Sparrow had performed appallingly. Of 612 of the early variants fired in combat, 97 hit their targets and 56 produced kills. That is a kill rate of a little over 9%. Of all those launches, exactly 2 produced a kill beyond visual range, which was the entire purpose for which the weapon had been bought. A later version, specifically modified to work in close quarters maneuvering, managed roughly 13%. The reasons were layered. The missiles were unreliable in a period when solid-state electronics was still maturing. The seekers struggled against ground clutter. There were minimum ranges below which the weapon could not arm and fuse properly, and pilots frequently found themselves inside them. The requirement to hold the lock meant a pilot who fired and then had to defend himself against a second aircraft had thrown his missile away. And the rules of engagement that forced visual identification meant many launches happened at exactly the ranges where the weapon worked worst. By 1989, the Sparrow was a considerably better missile. The variant in service used a monopole seeker, was far more resistant to jamming, and was a genuinely different weapon from its ancestors. 2 years after the Libyan engagement in the Gulf War of 1991, it would finally deliver what had been promised 25 years earlier, with 30 of 44 launches hitting and 24 kills, a hit rate above 68%. None of that improvement helped on the morning of January 4, 1989. 3 Sparrows were fired at the 2 Libyan fighters. 2 of them did nothing at all, and the cause was not the missile, not the seeker, and not the electronics. It was a switch, set wrongly in the cockpit before launch, a known recurring problem with that missile fired from that model of aircraft at that time. The most expensive part of the system worked. The part that failed was the interface between a human being under pressure and a machine that did not tell him clearly enough what state it was in, which is precisely and uncomfortably the same category of failure that had destroyed an airliner over the Strait of Hormuz 6 months earlier. The winter of 1988 into 1989 was one of the worst periods in the entire relationship, and almost none of it had to do with aircraft. Through the autumn of 1988, American intelligence had been building a case about a facility near the town of Rabta, some 60 miles south of Tripoli. Officially, it was a pharmaceutical plant. The United States State Department assessed that it was a chemical weapons plant capable of producing mustard and nerve agents in quantity, and that it had probably already begun doing so. Reporting in the American press at the turn of the year detailed the involvement of a West German chemical engineering firm in its construction, and the story became a major public controversy in both countries. Libya denied everything. In December, President Ronald Reagan stated publicly that a military strike against the plant was not being ruled out. 2 weeks before the engagement, on December the 21st, 1988, an American airliner was destroyed by a bomb over the Scottish town of Lockerbie, killing 270 people. It is important to be exact about this because it is a point that is frequently got wrong. At the beginning of January 1989, responsibility for that bombing was genuinely unknown, and early investigative attention pointed elsewhere. Libyan involvement was not formally alleged until indictments were issued in 1991, more than 2 years later. What the bombing contributed at the time was atmosphere, and there was a great deal of atmosphere already. Into this, on schedule and by a route planned long in advance, came the United States ship John F. Kennedy and carrier Air Wing 3, transiting eastward through the Mediterranean toward a port visit at Haifa in Israel. The battle group commander did not assume the transit would be uneventful. Aircrew were given a specific briefing on the rules of engagement, in anticipation of the possibility that Libyan aircraft might come out to meet them. Those rules mattered more than any piece of equipment aboard the ship, and they had a particular shape. Under the 6th Fleet, rules then in force, a Libyan aircraft did not have to fire first to be declared hostile. It was enough that it continued to turn toward an American aircraft that had repeatedly attempted to turn away. The authority to make that judgment and to fire had been delegated downward. To the crews themselves, nobody on the carrier was going to make the decision for them. That delegation was deliberate because at the closing speeds involved, there is no time to consult anybody, and the alternative to delegating the decision is asking a crew to accept the first missile before responding. Set against that were the raw capabilities of the 2 aircraft, and the mismatch was not marginal. The Tomcat could detect the Flogger at a range where the Flogger could not detect the Tomcat, could identify it optically at a range where the Libyan pilot would see nothing at all, and could engage it with radar-guided missiles from beyond visual range. It carried 2 crew, one of whom did nothing but manage that picture. The Flogger carried 1 man with a less capable radar that handled poorly against sea clutter, notoriously restricted rearward visibility, and a doctrinal dependence on a ground controller who, on this particular morning, was too far away to help. The Americans understood that asymmetry better than the Libyans knew. Through the 1970s and 80s, the United States had quietly acquired a number of Soviet-built fighters and flown them in a secret exploitation and training program, so that American aircrew could learn precisely what these aircraft could and could not do, and could train against the real thing rather than an approximation of it. That program was still classified in January 1989. A reporter broke the story 9 days after the engagement, establishing that Navy crews had trained against genuine Soviet fighters before they ever met Libyan ones. The last piece of the picture was the mission itself, which was not a confrontation at all. American A-6 intruders were conducting an exercise well to the north, south of the island of Crete. The Tomcats were flying combat air patrol, protecting the carrier and covering those aircraft. 2 Tomcats of Fighter Squadron 14 held the western station, 2 Tomcats of Fighter Squadron 32 held the eastern station, and an E-2C Hawkeye orbited behind them, its rotating radar sweeping the coast, watching for exactly what was about to happen. The Squadron 32 aircraft had just taken fuel from a tanker. Each carried 4 Sparrows and 2 Sidewinders, an incomplete load having launched before the full complement could be fitted. The lead aircraft, call-sign Gypsy 207, was flown by Commander Joseph Connolly, the squadron's commanding officer, with Commander Leo Enright in the back seat. The second aircraft, Gypsy 202, was flown by Lieutenant Herman Cook III, with Lieutenant Commander Stephen Collins behind him. At a few minutes before noon, the Hawkeye reported aircraft lifting off from the coast. From that call to the moment both Libyan fighters were burning on the water would take 4 minutes and change. The first radar contact came at 72 nautical miles. That number is worth pausing on because it is the entire argument in a single figure. At 72 miles, the Libyan aircraft were an abstraction. They were flying at around 8,000 feet at about 420 knots, and their heading pointed directly at the American fighters. Enright, in the back of the lead Tomcat, had them on the radar and was working the intercept. The Libyan pilots at that distance had nothing. Connolly and Cook began by giving them room. The American fighters turned off their heading by roughly 30 degrees, a maneuver deliberate enough to be obvious on any radar scope and unambiguous in its meaning. The Libyan aircraft turned as well and came back onto a collision heading. The Americans did it again. Same result. The Tomcats also came down, descending from around 20,000 feet to 3,000. This was not evasion. It was a calculated exploitation of the enemy's weakness. A radar looking down at a low-flying aircraft over water has to pick that aircraft out of the enormous reflected return from the sea itself, and the Libyan radar was poor at it. Going low did not hide the Tomcats from the ground controller, but it made them much harder for the men in the MiG cockpits to hold on their own scopes, and it meant that the AA-7 Apex missiles under their wings, which needed a solid radar lock to be worth anything, were far less likely to have one. 3 turns. 4. Each time the Americans opened the door. Each time the Libyans closed it. Somewhere in this sequence the carrier's air warfare commander transmitted the phrase, "Warning yellow, weapons hold." That transmission has been misunderstood ever since. It did not forbid the crews from firing. It signaled that a threat existed and that peacetime rules still applied, meaning the crews were required to assess hostile intent rather than engage automatically. Coming in the middle of an intercept, however, it created a moment of genuine confusion in 2 cockpits that were already extremely busy. 53 seconds after noon, Enright made the call that would be played on television screens around the world 2 days later. The contacts, he reported, had jinked back at him again for the 5th time. They were on his nose, inside 20 miles. The next words were "Master arm on." That is the moment the engagement actually turned, and it happened before a single missile left an aircraft. 2 men in a cockpit had watched 5 deliberate, unmistakable attempts to avoid a fight be answered 5 times by an aircraft turning back to face them. There was no ambiguity left to resolve and no time left to resolve it in. 27 seconds later, at a range of somewhere between 12 and 14 miles, the lead Tomcat fired a Sparrow. It did not guide. A second Sparrow went at around 10 miles. It did not guide either. Both had been launched with a switch in the wrong position, and the 2 most expensive seconds of the entire engagement produced nothing whatsoever. The Americans then did something that only a 2-seat fighter with a shared picture can do cleanly. They split. Connolly broke one way, Cook the other, opening the formation so that the Libyan aircraft could not engage both without committing to one. Both MiGs followed Cook. That was the decisive error, and it was not the Libyan pilot's fault in any personal sense. Their controller could not see the split. Nobody told them that by turning onto one American fighter, they were presenting their flanks to the other. Collins, in the back of Gypsy 202, took the lead MiG at around 5 miles and fired a Sparrow. This one guided. It struck the Libyan aircraft in the right side of the fuselage near the intake, and the aircraft came apart. Connolly, meanwhile, had used the split exactly as intended and was coming around into the rear quadrant of the second MiG, into the cone behind it where the Flogger pilot's rearward visibility was at its worst and where a heat-seeking missile does its best work. He selected the Sidewinder and got nothing. no acquisition tone in his headset, which is the sound a sidewinder makes when its seeker has found a heat source and is ready to be released. The problem was the switch. He still had the Sparrow selected. A sidewinder cannot give you a tone if the aircraft is not looking for one, and in the middle of a maneuvering engagement, closing on an enemy fighter, the pilot had to be reminded to change weapons. The recorded cockpit audio of that moment contains an entirely understandable obscenity. Then the tone came up. The sidewinder came off the rail at about 1.5 miles and struck the second MiG in the fuselage behind the cockpit. 103 seconds after the master arm call, both Libyan aircraft were gone. 2 parachutes appeared. Connolly reported splashing 2 floggers with 2 good shoots in the air. The Tomcats descended to a few hundred feet, accelerated to around 500 knots and left to the north. From first radar contact to the second kill was a little over 4 minutes, and for all but the last 100 seconds of it, the Americans had been trying to leave. President Reagan was woken shortly before 3 in the morning Washington time by a telephone call from his national security advisor, Lieutenant General Colin Powell. The president was told that 2 Libyan fighters had been shot down over the Mediterranean and that both American aircraft had recovered safely aboard the carrier. What the administration did next was, by the standards of the period, genuinely unusual. Within 2 days, the Pentagon released the evidence. Not a summary of the evidence, not an official narrative of it, but the material itself. Photographs taken by the Tomcat's television camera. Video from the cockpit displays. The recorded radio transmissions between the 2 American crews, including the confusion, the missed missiles, the swearing about the volume knob and the flat professional voice counting down the range. Journalists, and through them, the public watched and listened to an American air combat engagement from inside the cockpits within 48 hours of it happening. The reason was straightforward. The administration had a case to make, and it wanted the case made by the tapes rather than by a spokesman. Secretary of Defense Frank Carlucci and Admiral William Crowe, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, briefed the press together. Carlucci was emphatic on 2 points. The first was that the shoot-down had nothing whatsoever to do with the chemical plant at Rabta, which was roughly 600 miles away from where the engagement occurred and had no connection to it. The second was that the American crews had done everything possible to avoid the fight, changing speed, altitude and direction repeatedly while the Libyan aircraft continued to close in a hostile manner. Reagan said the pilots had acted completely in self-defense. Support was not confined to one party. Senator Sam Nunn, a Democrat and one of the most respected voices on defense matters in the Congress, made the point that mattered most bluntly. In an era of modern technology, he said, you cannot wait until another aircraft has fired in order to defend yourself, because by then it is too late. Libya's response was immediate and furious. Gaddafi described the engagement as American terrorism and promised retaliation. Tripoli's account was that the 2 aircraft had been unarmed reconnaissance machines flying a routine mission over international waters and that they had been ambushed. Libya took the matter to the United Nations Security Council in January, requesting an emergency session. No action was taken against the United States. The photographs complicated Libya's case considerably. Analysts examining the imagery from the Tomcat's camera identified missiles beneath the lead MiG's wings, and the assessment reported in the American press was that the aircraft carried 2 AA-7 Apex radar-guided missiles and 2 AA-8 aphid heat seekers. An aircraft carrying that loadout is not on a reconnaissance mission. There was a second harvest from the engagement that nobody announced at a press conference, and it was arguably worth more than the 2 aircraft. An intercept of this kind is an intelligence event. For several minutes, an entire national air defense system was operating under real pressure, and the Americans were listening to all of it. The Hawkeye orbiting behind the fighters was not simply a radar picket. Aircraft and ships in the battle group could record the Libyan ground controller talking to his pilots, the frequencies he used, the procedures he followed, how quickly he passed information, and how badly the picture degraded at range. They could observe which radars came up and which did not, and how the Libyan system reacted when its aircraft stopped answering. You cannot buy that. You cannot generate it in an exercise, because an exercise is rehearsed and the participants know it is not real. Reporting in the American press within days of the engagement noted the intelligence value bluntly, and it is one of the reasons the confrontation was studied so closely afterward. The Libyans lost 2 aircraft. They also, without any way of preventing it, gave away a detailed picture of exactly how their air defense system behaved when it was actually being used. There was also, briefly, a second carrier. The United States ship Theodore Roosevelt was prepared to sail toward the region as tensions spiked. In the event, nothing further happened. Libya did not send more aircraft out. The Kennedy continued east and made its port call. The confrontation that both governments had spent a week bracing for simply stopped. There is one more consequence, and it is the kind that is only visible with hindsight. Those two MiGs were the last aircraft shot down by American fighters for over 2 years. The next time an American fighter pilot destroyed an enemy aircraft in the air, it would be over Iraq in January 1991, in a completely different kind of war fought with a completely different set of rules. The 4 kills against Libya, 2 in 1981 and 2 in 1989, were the entire American air-to-air record of the 1980s. But the argument over whether the second engagement should have happened at all did not end with the press conference. It moved quietly into closed rooms in the Congress, and what emerged from it several months later was considerably less tidy than the version the tapes had told. In late March 1989, after a series of classified briefings from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Representative Les Aspin, made his own assessment public, and it did not match the Pentagon's. Aspin's objection turned on a technical detail that the released footage did not settle. The justification for firing at 12 miles rested on the threat posed by the AA-7 Apex, the radar-guided missile the Libyan aircraft were carrying. But a radar-guided missile of that generation needs the launching aircraft's radar to illuminate the target. The Libyan pilots never turned on the radars needed to guide those missiles, not once at any point in the intercept. Aspin also argued that the Libyan turns before the American launch had been slighter than the public account suggested, and were not on their own clearly hostile. He was blunt about the Pentagon's framing, describing the account of the American attempts to avoid the engagement in terms that no press office would want repeated. That criticism has to be weighed carefully because it is not the whole picture either. A fighter pilot cannot tell in the cockpit whether the aircraft coming at him has decided not to switch on his radar or has simply not switched it on yet. A radar can be brought up in seconds. The absence of a radar lock at 12 miles tells you what has happened, not what is about to. Against that, Aspin's point stands as a genuine one about the difference between a threat that has materialized and a threat that could materialize, and the distance between those two things is precisely where peacetime rules of engagement live. What made the debate politically potent was the shadow of the Vincennes, only 6 months in the past. 2 incidents, both involving American forces firing at aircraft that had not fired at them, both justified by hostile intent rather than hostile act, and one of them catastrophically wrong. That was the pattern the Congress was actually examining, and the fact that the second incident had been correct did not make the pattern go away. The broader record around the engagement filled in over the following years. The secret program that had given American aircrew the chance to fly against real Soviet fighters was eventually declassified, and it is now clear how much of the Tomcat crew's confidence came from having already flown against the type they met that morning, rather than from a briefing about it. The Sparrow's redemption came in 1991 when the improved variant finally delivered the beyond visual range performance that had been promised since the 1960s. There is one part of the accounting that has never been completed, and it should be said plainly. The names of the 2 Libyan pilots are not established in the available record. Both ejected. Both were seen under good parachutes over open water. No Libyan rescue operation appears to have been mounted from a coastline only 40 miles away, and neither man was recovered. 2 men flew a mission they had been ordered to fly, under the direction of a controller who could not see what was happening to them, and then vanished out of the historical record entirely. Whatever one concludes about the engagement, that is a real gap and not a rhetorical one. There is also a caution that belongs in any honest account of this fight. The released radio audio is authentic, but the transcripts of it that circulate today do not always agree about which of the 4 men said which line, and some published versions place the crews in the wrong aircraft altogether. The sequence of events is firm. Individual attributions of specific sentences should be treated with more care than they usually receive. Commander Joseph Connolly and Commander Leo Enright both retired from the United States Navy as captains. Neither wrote a memoir. Neither built a public career on what happened north of Tobruk. On September 30, 2006, the aircraft they had flown that morning was put on public display at the National Air and Space Museum's annex outside Washington. It had been rebuilt to a later standard and served on with another squadron in the intervening years, and by then the Tomcat itself was finished, retired from American service that same year. Connolly and Enright were there as honoured guests. Two men in their 60s, standing under an aeroplane at a ceremony most of the visitors that day would have walked past without understanding what they were looking at. Lieutenant Herman Cook III left the Navy and became an airline pilot, eventually a captain and line-check airman on a modern wide-body jet, which means that for years afterward people flew across oceans with him, without any idea that the man in the left seat had shot down a fighter with a radar missile at 5 miles. In May 2018, he appeared on a panel at an aviation museum in Seattle, sitting alongside one of the pilots from the 1981 engagement, and, in a detail that says something about how strange the aircraft's history became, a former Iranian F-14 pilot. The public record of Lieutenant Commander Stephen Collins is thinner. Despite searching, no reliable source establishes what decorations any of the 4 men received for the engagement, which is a slightly startling gap for an action that was on every television network in the world within 2 days. That is the shape of it. 4 men flew a routine patrol, spent most of it trying not to have a fight, had one anyway, and then went quietly back to their careers while the argument about what they had done rolled on without them in rooms they were never invited into. The 2 aircraft they destroyed came from an air force that no longer exists in any recognizable form. Muammar Gaddafi was removed from power and killed in 2011, and the Libyan state fragmented. The Air Force fragmented with it. What remains is divided between rival authorities, principally the internationally recognized government based in Tripoli in the west and the forces of Khalifa Haftar based in the east, around Benghazi and Tobruk. Both sides have scraped together what they could from the old inventory. Soviet-era fighters, including MiG-23s, were pulled out of storage, refurbished with outside help, and flown in combat during the fighting of the last decade. At least one MiG-23 was shot down over Tripoli in December 2019. A handful may still be airworthy, flown by an air arm that is a shadow of the force Gaddafi bought. What has filled the space is more consequential than what was lost. Since 2019, Russian military contractors, initially operating as a private company and later folded into a formal structure under the Russian Defense Ministry, have established themselves at Libyan airbases. In May 2020, American Africa Command released satellite imagery showing Russian combat aircraft, including MiG-29s and Su-24s, deployed to the airfields at Al-Jufra and Al-Qadim. Since then, the Russian presence has expanded rather than contracted, with infrastructure work at multiple Libyan bases and heavy weapons deliveries. A military parade in Benghazi in May 2025 displayed Russian-supplied air defense and rocket artillery systems that had not previously been seen in Libyan service. Russia has also pursued access to a Mediterranean port, with Tobruk among the locations discussed. That is the same Tobruk the MiGs launched from in 1989. The United States has responded by returning to a country it spent decades bombing and avoiding. In February 2025, American bombers conducted a demonstration near Sirte with forces from both Libyan factions observing. In April 2025, an American warship made a port call in Libya, the first in roughly half a century. In the spring of 2026, an American-led multinational exercise included a component hosted in Libya for the first time, bringing rival Libyan units into the same training program in an explicit attempt to encourage reunification and to slow Russian entrenchment. The Tomcat, meanwhile, is gone from American service and nearly gone from the world. Iran remains the only operator, flying the aircraft delivered before the revolution, and its fleet has dwindled to a handful of airworthy machines. During the fighting between Iran and Israel in 2025 and the wider campaign that followed into 2026, Israeli and American strikes destroyed Iranian F-14s on the ground at Isfahan. Satellite imagery in March 2026 showed multiple destroyed airframes on the ramp, and at least some analysts assessed that a number of them were decoys rather than real aircraft. So the specific hardware has almost entirely disappeared. The line of death is no longer enforced by anybody. The men who flew the engagement are retired or, in one case, still flying passengers. And yet the question they were handed at 72 miles that morning has not aged at all. An unidentified aircraft is closing. Your sensors can see it long before it can see you. Your rules permit you to fire before it fires. What exactly is the standard of proof, and how many seconds do you have to meet it? Every generation of technology since has made the first half of that question easier and the second half harder. Detection ranges have grown. Weapons have grown longer-legged. Uncrewed aircraft have removed the pilot from one side of some encounters entirely, and with him the ability to make eye contact with an intent. The decision window keeps shrinking, and the consequences of getting it wrong keep growing. In the Strait of Hormuz, it was answered wrongly by the finest sensors any navy had ever put to sea and a crew who were certain they were under attack. North of Tobruk, it was answered correctly by a fighter with a dangerous engine and 2 missiles that did nothing at all. The difference between those 2 outcomes had very little to do with the weapons involved. It had to do with a camera that let 2 men look at something before it could look back, and with a second seat that meant one of them could spend the whole 4 minutes doing nothing but looking. The United States Navy spent an enormous amount of money on a fighter that was heavier than it needed to be, more complicated than it wanted to be, and fitted with an engine that killed a significant number of its own crews. It did that because it had concluded, from a war it had already fought badly, that the hardest problem in air combat was not hitting the target. It was knowing what the target was. Libya spent a comparable proportion of its national wealth on aircraft that were fast, modern, and, in the moment that counted, blind. Not because the machines were bad, because the system around them put the eyes on the ground, 50 miles away, watching a picture that could not be updated fast enough to matter. 4 minutes north of Tobruk, one air force could see and the other could not, and everything else was arithmetic.